The Blair Witch Project is a movie about the dangers of women and why it's actually a bad idea for them to have their own thoughts and ideas. Written and directed by Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick for a budget of 60,000 fake American Monopoly monies, they'd hit it big with their North Korean propaganda film aimed at making people afraid of nature. But before helping to kick off the rebirth of the found footage genre and giving thousands of people around the world motion sickness because they're not tough enough to watch the TV, they'd have to create a realistic, believable, and most importantly, a scary urban legend about the most terrifying thing known to man: a female. Originally intending to be a part of the Blair Witch Project movie until being forcefully removed like a parasitic twin in the womb, Daniel and Eduardo would create a companion piece to the movie, a documentary called The Curse of the Blair Witch, which, like all documentaries, is completely fictitious in every way. In the fictional town of Blair, in the fictional country of America, there was a fictional creature known as a woman who had her own thoughts, feelings and beliefs, so was quite understandably put to death for it. The year was 1785, and several children would accuse a woman named Ellie Kedward of trying to steal their blood, which they didn't take too kindly to on account of not liking to share, resulting in her being accused of being a witch, kind of ignoring the most rational explanation. Maybe she was just a bit thirsty. Your blood led a few kids and everyone gets all uptight about it. Sometimes people make mistakes. But it also could have been something to do with the fact that she was an old Catholic lady in a Protestant community living in a country that's incredibly tolerant of other people's beliefs. Racism is okay if it's against the Catholics or old people. And you know what they say about other people's religions. Ooh, gross. She was blindfolded and taken out into the middle of the woods during one of the worst recorded winters and tied to a tree and left to die, because that's what Ellie Kedward got for being quite the enjoyer of children's inside juices. The townsfolk, with their anti-kid bleeding agenda, attempted to go on with their lives after engaging in everyone's favourite communal activity of tying old women to trees and leaving them there, but a year later, all of the kids who accused her, and half of the town's children too, because screw those kids, suddenly disappeared because one of the locals really liked the way children's soup tasted. Terrified by the idea of free childcare, the entire town proceeded to flee from Blair because there's nothing more scary than a strong independent woman doing her own thing. It remained abandoned for 38 years before being rediscovered, resettled, and renamed to Burkittsville. And not long after claiming their free real estate and moving into a perfectly good town that couldn't possibly have been abandoned for any bad reason whatsoever, the new residents soon learned that America is a capitalist society and that nothing is in fact free. They were going to need to pay for this, and the currency for this transaction? The lives of your children. No, not the free labour. While gathered at a nearby creek to stare at some water or something, 12 witnesses supposedly saw a hand emerge from the water and grab hold of a little girl before pulling her below, and all 12 of them proceeded to do absolutely nothing about it because this was the dark times before Netflix and you had to make do with whatever entertainment you had. After not intervening due to their extreme phobia of little girls, the body was supposedly never discovered, despite the fact that this was incredibly shallow water, as they all thought that she just really needed to take a bath or something. A permanent one, meaning that the only possible explanation for this horrific tragedy is witchcraft and definitely not negligence. For a week, the water would fill up with oil due to it being common knowledge that little girls are 60% oil, as well as floating sticks being tied together making an appearance too. A year after that, another little girl would be lured into the woods by a floating woman, floating being a little known side effect of a woman's menstrual cycle, where she was then told to wait in a basement and stare at a wall due to the witch being self-conscious of the mess in her house. A search party would be sent out to look for the little girl, but would never return home. Shortly after the search party was sent out, the child would return to Burkittsville unharmed. But with no sign of the search party returning, a search party was sent out to be a search party for the search party, because there's nothing more fun than a bunch of dudes hanging out in the woods. The initial search party would eventually be discovered, lounging around and not doing a very good job, due to the unfortunate side effect of being completely disemboweled. And after finding them at a location, rather appropriately named Coffin Rock, the other search party would run away in fear because they didn't want to get blood on their clothes, before returning with even more help later to discover that the bodies and any sign of them were gone. Either someone in the second search party was incredibly hungry, or there was something even more sinister out there. A woman. Time would pass, and come 1940, kids would once again start to go missing due to them being too poor to afford a phone with Find My iPhone on. Eventually, a hermit living up in the woods by himself would make his way down into town before announcing, "I'm finally done." With that obviously meaning, "I've kidnapped a bunch of kids and not literally anything else." He was immediately arrested for speaking words, before the police would go out to his shack to discover 7 bodies which had all been disemboweled, as well as having pagan markings etched into their skin, as this man's kidnapped more children children than your average Minecraft YouTuber. The accused, a man named Rustin Parr, being an enjoyer of kids, was believed to have lured the kids into the woods by offering to show them a really cool stick or something before ultimately taking their lives. And a survivor named Kyle Brody, who was kept by Rustin, was forced to stand in the corner and face the wall while the atrocities were being committed because Rustin would get performance anxiety. And while being held in police custody, Rustin Parr would explain that he committed these horrendous crimes because a woman in his head told him to. Just like the woman in my head told me to make this video. And luckily for me, this is where the fake documentary made to accompany the fake documentary that was made to accompany the fake movie comes into play. Because yes, they made more than one documentary about the Blair Witch Project, which just so happens to be alright with me, as my neurodivergence loves it when I watch multiple hours of fictitious documentaries that teach me absolutely nothing about the real world. The Burkittsville 7, directed by Ben Rock, who would do the production design for the Blair Witch Project, you know, like being in charge of where this stick and that rock goes and stuff, is a deeper look into the Rustin Parr case, as well as Kyle Brody's aftermath after he was forced to look at bricks in the corner for a really long time. Even before Kyle's abduction, he was known for being quite the inquisitive little kid, as like any normal prepubescent boy, would force cats into mailboxes and cut the limbs off frogs because they didn't have cocomelon yet. Over the years following his abduction, Kyle would find himself in and out of psychological institutions for the criminally insane because he was just kind of a fun guy. And a documentary within this already fake documentary, accompanying another fake documentary, would be filmed at one of these institutions, and it would contain footage of Kyle mumbling the words "never given" to himself, a phrase that the guards who watched over Rustin Parr would report that he repeatedly screamed. A historian and Rustin Parr truther would reach out to the creator of this documentary to request extra footage of Kyle, and would discover a shot of him writing in the ancient witchcraft language, Transitus Fluvi, a language which was written all over the walls of Rustin Parr's shack, leading this man to the logical conclusion that Kyle Brody, who was a literal child at the time, managed to convince Rustin Parr to kidnap and kill those children over the course of a year before forcing Rustin to take the fall for it. And by take the fall for it, I mean quite literally fall from the gallows with a noose around his neck. So briefly going back to the Curse of the Blair Witch, the fake documentary that I was talking about before talking about the fake documentary, it had come to be believed that the Blair Witch would resurface roughly every 60 years or so, a time frame that this very documentary has already proven wrong. But much like ethics, continuity is not something which is all that important. So about 60 years after the Rustin Parr incident, a group of film students, Heather, Josh and Mike, would decide to create a documentary for themselves and head out into those very woods to produce something for Heather's film class. They would set off into those woods and never return. And 10 days after they were reported missing, the searches were called off on account of people not really liking them anyway. A year would pass, and an anthropology dig would be conducted in the forest at the remains of a colonial-era home, and beneath piles of stone and undisturbed layers of ash and earth from when the building originally burnt down, the trio's footage would finally be discovered. Their footage is what would be known as the Blair Witch Project. But as we all know, the Blair Witch, much like the Albanians, is a myth. And while often being cited as the catalyst to kick off the found footage revival, it wasn't the first of the genre. That award goes to Grandpa's weird home videos that we found after he passed away, but we don't talk about them. Taking a page out of Ruggero Deodato's book with 1980's Cannibal Holocaust, they murdered a bunch of animals and abused the local indigenous population. I mean, Ed and Dan went out of their way to sell the illusion of all of this being real. Ruggero Deodato may have had his actors hide from the public and not appear in any movies for a while, but Ed and Dan had a far more hardcore idea. They made a website, because it was 1999, and websites were still cool. So, while not being the first, it certainly helped pave the way for the likes of Paranormal Activity and Wreck, and most importantly my favourite of them all, 2016's Slender. So written and directed by friends Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, the Blair Witch Project begins with a group of people walking in the woods in search of a woman, an idea that the pair had come up with after realising that they found documentaries based on paranormal incidents far more terrifying than actual horror movies, perfectly explaining their hyperfixation with creating their own documentaries as they simply physically cannot stop. The idea of the movie was simple: put 3 people alone in the woods and physically and psychologically abuse them for entertainment. And to get the investors on board, they put together an 8-minute, you guessed it, documentary, and just like they would do with the general public, led them to believe that the entire thing was real, as nothing makes investors want to give you their money quite like the thought of a naked old woman tied to a tree. After finding their 3 actors, Heather Donahue, Joshua Leonard, and Michael C. Williams, they were given a handful of days to learn how to use the video camera and audio equipment, and just like an unwanted toddler with a birth defect in the medieval times, was sent out alone into the woods. Being given no script and only vague outlines of ideas being left for them in film canisters at various points in the woods, the Blair Witch Project is as real as it gets. And by that, I mean nothing about it was real, and they were just all really good at improv. One of the first scenes in the movie is Heather in Burkittsville Cemetery, the resting place for all of those children who were abducted back in the 1940s and used to repaint Rustin Parr's basement. After talking to some of the locals and learning some of the backstory that the documentary went into far more detail on, they park their car at the side of the road and head off into the woods, with one of their very first stops being Coffin Rock, the place where the underachieving search party was found taking a nap. For their first night, they sleep without incident, apart from Josh reporting the next morning that he swore he heard someone cackling in the woods in the middle of the night, not realizing that Heather just had a really funny dream, and is also insane. Wondering why the trees were laughing at them last night, they decide to venture deeper into the woods in search of the Ents, before coming across multiple piles of deliberately placed rocks that are really throwing off their feng shui. After rebalancing their chi and deciding to set up camp again as it's starting to get dark, they're all woken up in the middle of the night to various noises in the forest, which sounds like multiple people surrounding their camp, despite them being a 2 days walk deep into the woods. A fun nod to the fact that it actually is a group of people surrounding their camp, as Ed and Dan are both genuinely tormenting the three of them out there as they're forced to record it all. Hey, welcome back to my new vlog. On today's episode, we're going to be getting traumatized deep in the woods by a bunch of sociopaths. The next day, the trio decides that they don't want another encounter with the funny wilderness people, so they start to head back to their car, before realizing that nobody actually knows where the car is, and they're all in way over their heads. And as much as I love walking through the wilderness for days looking for a dead woman, you won't catch me doing that. I'm lazy. So once again, they're forced to camp for the night, and after hearing the noises again, wake up to find piles of rocks outside of their tent, as they're being stalked by an autistic toddler who has an obsession with stacking things. With the map also nowhere in sight, Mike eventually admits to throwing the map into the creek the previous day due to his overwhelming hatred for the planet and wanting to pollute it at every available opportunity. After showing that map who's boss by dooming himself and his two friends to certain death for no other reason than I guess he just has really poor impulse control, they come across sticks hanging from trees tied together in various different symbols, much like the ones described being found in the creek a week after the little girl was pulled in. Terrified at the prospect of encountering a little girl, and with it once again starting to get dark, they're forced to camp again, and are woken up in the middle of the night to the strange sound of something or someone groaning, mixed with the sound of children laughing. They end up running off into the darkness because little children are gross, and they can hear the sound of a baby screaming. None of them wanting to take on the responsibility of some weird forest baby, they stay out of their tents for the night and only return once the sounds have stopped and the sun has started to come up, for them to discover that some of their belongings are gone, and what remains has been messed with. Hungry, scared, tired, and desperate, they just pick a direction and begin walking, in hopes of being able to find a way out of the woods. But despite walking south all day, they've somehow managed to walk right back to a location that they've already been, meaning that the whole day of walking was a complete waste. With the entire day wasted, and the sun coming down once again, they make camp for the night, before waking up in the morning to discover that Josh is gone, with Heather and Mike genuinely not realizing that Josh would be disappearing in the middle of the night due to Eduardo and Daniel passing him a note the previous day, telling him to wait until his two friends are asleep before abandoning them in the middle of the woods. A few more days then pass of just Heather and Mike, with them both hearing what appears to be Josh screaming out to them in pain from the darkness, but ignoring him on account of Josh being a crybaby. It then eventually cuts to the iconic scene of Heather vlogging herself in the woods, surrounded by complete darkness. She apologizes to Mike and Josh's family for making them come out here, and takes complete accountability for everything. Heather and Mike then hear Josh calling out to them in the distance, and despite ignoring all of his other pleas as they thought it was just something luring them out there, they decide to try and find out anyway, before coming across the remains of a ruined house. And after finally discovering it, the Unabomber's shack, they head inside and find child-sized handprints and rune markings all over the walls, as this place has been decorated by a clumsy infant. Confused by the strange sense of interior decoration, Mike heads down into the basement, when suddenly he drops the camera on the floor and it goes silent, as he comes to the sudden realization, what the hell am I doing in this basement and why am I filming it? Heather, wanting to tell Mike off for dropping the expensive piece of equipment, comes down after him to find him standing in the corner and facing the wall, just how Rustin Parr made Kyle stare at the wall back in the 1940s. Suddenly, she drops the camera and goes silent too, and the movie comes to an end, much like Heather's career as a documentarian. And what this genre has shown us time and time again is that less is more. At least that's what my wife tells me. But due to the fact that Ed and Dan simply couldn't afford to create a villain to be seen, like an insecure ex-partner, they were forced to manipulate your mind, create fear out of the unknown, gaslight you because it's funny. No matter how hard you look, you never directly see anything. Your mind is left to fill in the blanks, so you're forced to conjure up the most horrific thing that you can think of: a woman. And much like herpes, the after effects of this movie can still be felt to this day, with the popularity of the found footage genre skyrocketing after a few people went for a walk in the woods and decided to film it. So what do you get when you mix a fresh and interesting concept with Hollywood? A perpetual state of mental retardation, because the Blair Witch has gone from something original and unique to its time, and completely skips over the part where they milk their newfound success for everything that it's worth, and instead decide to make their new big-brained idea, create the ultimate product of its time. And by that, I mean the movie, which is no longer a found footage movie by the way, released in the year 2000, does perhaps the most year 2000 thing it ever could do, and begins with a helicopter shot over a forest while Marilyn Manson plays in the background. They finally did it. They created art. But slightly questionable life decisions aside, before we get to see all of that, there's something we need to discuss first. My Strange Lump. I mean another documentary. Because if there's anything more than these guys like to do than making fake documentaries, it's making fake documentaries and getting paid to do it. Shadow of the Blair Witch is a documentary also written by Ben Rock, who created the Burkittsville 7 documentary, as apparently this man can't stop making things up and really wants you to believe them. The second movie doesn't take place in the world of the Blair Witch Project. It takes place somewhere even worse. Our World. This is a documentary that's supposedly documenting the events of a slight inconvenience, known as a multiple homicide, that was inspired by the first movie. A man named Jeff Patterson is in trouble with the police for believing that he should legally be allowed to experiment on short people, and for also supposedly killing a bunch of people in the woods. Jeff is not only accused of being a murderer, but being accused of being a fanboy, as apparently he was completely obsessed with the Blair Witch Project. And instead of doing what people obsessed with weird things do on the internet and write some smutty fanfiction about it, he decided to do what the other weird people on the internet obsessed with things do: commit murder. Using this made-up contraption known as the internet, Jeff would reach out to strangers after exposing himself to them on Omegle, before somehow convincing them to go on a Blair Witch hunt with him. These people's bodies would then be discovered disemboweled and ritualistically laid out on Coffin Rock, just like how that search party was discovered back in the 1800s. But unlike the previous documentaries, this one is almost entirely irrelevant and aims to recapture some of that magic that was created with the first movie. Jeff was a schizophrenic who heard voices. In other words, he liked podcasts so much, he made them up in his head. And because of these voices, he once kidnapped a child and took them into the woods, which was once again a really unfortunate case of, come look at this really cool stick I found. But the law didn't see it that way, so after being released from a mental health facility for having an overactive imagination, his fascination of the Blair Witch would begin, and the movie Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2, sequel to the Book of Mormon, would aim to accurately recreate the events surrounding the murders. And by aim to accurately recreate the events surrounding the murders, I mean completely make it up, as this supposedly factual documentary doesn't go into nearly enough detail on the matter, leaving us to rely on the completely fictional movie to come up with more context. Directed by Joe Berlinger, Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 asks the question, what if we made the Blair Witch Project? Except not at all. We're introduced to Jeff and the rest of the group as he's picked them up for the Blair Witch tour, Stephen and his pregnant girlfriend Tristan as they plan to write a book about the witch, Erica, a dirt hippie, otherwise known as a Wiccan, and Kim, whose main personality traits include smoking cigarettes and lying on gravestones. Going to pay the witch a visit, who's nearly claimed more lives than the American healthcare system, Jeff takes them out to the remains of Rustin Parr's house and shows them where Heather, Mike and Josh's footage was found, for Jeff to now discover there's a large tree standing in the middle of the house that he swears wasn't there before. A large tree that he promptly just ignores, as apparently it's quite common for the witch to go into creative mode and to start spawning various pieces of foliage. That night, they all proceed to get absolutely wasted in the witch's honor, before a rival tour group arrives and they send them off to Coffin Rock by making up a lie about seeing some ghostly activity there. After they all eventually go to sleep, Tristan proceeds to dream about drowning her baby in the creek after being up all night, giving it fetal alcohol syndrome, or as I like to call it, fun parent syndrome. When they all eventually wake up the next day, they discover that Stephen and Tristan's work has been shredded, as Ellie Kedwood keeps a hidden shredder behind the unusually large tree, and that all of Jeff's cameras have been completely destroyed. Kim, using her magical womanly powers, is somehow able to see things in her mind, and knows exactly where to find the tapes, on account of women knowing everything, and they they discover the tapes in the exact same place that Heather, Mike and Josh's footage was supposedly discovered. Tristan then starts to bleed, as she never misses an opportunity to make something about her, and they take her to the hospital to discover that she's lost the baby. Well, she better go find it then. And while recovering in the hospital, Tristan sees a soaking wet, decomposing child, but doesn't think twice about it because they're in Maryland. The child, possibly being a reference to one of the Blair Witch's killings in the 1800s, with the little girl being pulled into the creek, who just really wanted to show Tristan her cool new dance moves. After Tristan's done talking to losers who can't swim, the group decide to head back to Jeff's house so they can watch back the tapes, so they can find out why they blacked out and woke up to everything being destroyed. Jeff's house being an old Civil War era factory, where health and safety precautions are merely nothing more than a suggestion. And it's when watching back the footage that they realise that one of them is actually a secret lumberjack, because that large tree is now nowhere to be seen. The Blair Witch is supposed to be a movie about making friends in the woods, not trees getting randomly shy. Stephen goes to check on Tristan while she's sleeping, but suddenly he hears the sounds of a crying girl coming from outside, and loving nothing more than the sound of a woman in distress, he opens the door to see what only can be described as an insult against God: a child. The same dancing child that Tristan had seen at the hospital. And while investigating the tapes further, they see a naked woman and are overcome with extreme confusion due to never seeing one of them before. And while his girlfriend is in the other room recovering from a miscarriage, Stephen is then seduced by Erica because nothing gets him in the mood quite like having his girlfriend bleed from the inside out, before Erica then slices open his chest with her bare hands, before they're then both suddenly sat at opposite ends of the table as if nothing had just happened. They inspect the footage some more to discover that the naked woman is actually Erica due to her not liking the way that clothes feel, something which seems to upset and confuse her as she doesn't understand why her boobies are on the TV. She then tells them that they brought something back from the woods with them, and it definitely wasn't a baby. Kim then heads to the store to buy some beer, as seeing naked people on the TV makes her thirsty, but arrives at the store to discover that they're racist against goths. After being discriminated against, she starts to drive back to Jeff's house before somehow accidentally ending up in England as her car is attacked by a group of teenagers. Suddenly, she then sees a group of 7 kids standing in the road, 7 kids that Rustin Parr killed, before crashing incredibly slowly into a pole. And despite it just being the front of the car that was slightly damaged, they all look out of the window the next morning to see that Kim has had a woman driver moment. After a hard day of killing babies and crashing cars, they decide to sit back, relax and watch some TV to find out that the other group of people who they sent to Coffin Rock had been brutally massacred in a recreation of the search party incident from the 1800s. But a dead competitor isn't a competitor worth worrying about, so that's one less thing for Jeff to stress about. That is, until it's immediately replaced by something else for Jeff to stress about, as he then discovers Erica naked and dead in his closet, which doesn't look like an unfortunate case of the strangle dangle gone wrong. Something which greatly upsets Jeff due to this not being his usual location for storing dead women. Something about this incident gives Kim the idea to play the tapes backwards, and they see a recreation of an average party at number 10 Downing Street as everyone proceeds to get naked and dances for hours. The footage then shows them all in a trance, destroying the camera equipment and all of the paperwork, while having what could generally be described as a really good time. Tristan appears to be the one orchestrating the entire thing, as she's wearing a really cool black cloak, and sends them all out to Coffin Rock after handing out weapons. After all of the destruction, Tristan picks up the camera to recreate the iconic shot of Heather from the first movie before that footage comes to an end. She drops the act and gets all nihilistic for a second and tells them that they're all going to die, before announcing that Tristan is gone, before wrapping a rope around her neck and standing next to a ledge, where she somehow annoys Stephen enough to commit a literal murder. After he pushes her on the rope swing, there's a flashback to them viciously butchering and castrating the other group in the woods, as Jeff, Stephen and Kim are blamed for the killings. Due to them channeling their inner modern influencer and recording their horrific crimes, the police have them on tape committing all of the killings. Not only all of the people at Coffin Rock, but also Kim killing the clerk while buying the beer, as well as CCTV footage of Jeff putting Erica in the closet, as well as footage of Stephen pushing Tristan off the ledge for her neck lengthening surgery. Except in this footage, she's begging for her life instead of convincing him to take it. And on a happy note, the movie then comes to an end with all of their friends now dead, as they were all possessed and manipulated by a ghost. So now that we've discussed the Blair Witch movie that hardly even takes place in the woods, it's now time to discuss the Blair Witch movie, except just not as good. Because 16 years later, they decided to do the entire thing again, as once again we'll be going on a journey to look at some twigs in the woods. Directed by Adam Wingard and written by Simon Barrett, the third entry in the series takes the franchise back to its found footage roots, with Adam and Simon having an established history in the genre already, going back to their early installments in the VHS franchise. This movie asks the question, what if we made the Blair Witch Project, but in HD? Being a direct sequel to the 1999 movie, ignoring the events of the 2000 sequel just how my father ignores me, it immediately begins with something running through what appears to be the house from the end of the original movie before something smashes through a door and gets them. But a freeze frame in the footage shows the reflection of a woman. A man named James, watching the footage online, believes that the woman is his older sister Heather, who disappeared when he was 4 years old. James wants to go into the forest to find his sister, but we all know women belong in the woods performing pagan rituals. It's where they're most happy. You can take the woman out of the woods, but you can't take the demonic spirit out of the woman. His friend Lisa, much like Heather all of those years ago, is filming a documentary for school, because we need a believable reason as to why this is a found footage movie, so let's use the exact same idea, why not? So friends, James, Lisa, Peter and his girlfriend Ashley head out to Burkittsville to try and uncover the truth about what happened to Heather all of those years ago, because screw those other two guys. Their plan is to find the house from the end of the original movie, which has never been discovered by search parties. This time around, technology has improved, so not only are they using handheld cameras, but they also have POV cameras and a drone, something which the witch doesn't take too kindly to on account of secretly being an Amish witch. After heading to Burkittsville, they meet up with some locals, Lane and Talia, the people who discovered and uploaded the footage, and they agree to let them join them on their search for Heather. After making it out to Mother Nature's public toilet, the forest, they investigate where Lane and Talia found the footage, before going to the creek where the little girl was pulled under by the emerging hand. The emerging hand that just wanted to teach her how to do those dance moves. While crossing the creek, Ashley cuts her foot because the water is extra sharp today, but luckily James is a paramedic and is able to take a look at it before sending her a bill for thousands of dollars when they get home. They camp for the night, and in the years since the original Blair Witch's release, the story of Ellie Kedwood has evolved from someone being tied to a tree and left to die, to being tied up high in a tree with rocks hanging from her limbs because they don't like short people. The next day, they wake up to discover hanging sticks surrounding the camp, the same kind that Heather, Mike and Josh found, before all realizing that they've slept in till 2 PM. But unlike the group from the previous movie, they didn't stay up all night speedrunning their baby's existence. They discover that Lane and Talia actually faked hanging the sticks up last night because they really wanted them to believe in the witch, so their genius idea was to just lie, exposing the fact that they haven't even seen the first movie due to the witch luring people in with a false sense of security and not doing anything the first night. Lane and Talia are forced to leave because get out of my swamp, and the rest of the group spend the day walking back to the car, only to end up in the exact same spot that they camped in. Walking in a straight line being somewhat of a desired skill around here, they're forced to camp for the night again as Ashley's foot is starting to hurt, due to her skin being no match for some light running water. Peter, loving to get up close and personal to women's feet, takes a look at the wound, and it appears to move on its own. Using the drone to try and find their way out, they immediately crash and lose it on account of not knowing how to fly a drone, as you're supposed to fly over things and not into them. Peter heads out from camp to collect some firewood, despite quite literally being surrounded by nothing but firewood, and after hearing some noises, it looks like he can see someone standing between the branches of a tree, causing him to panic due to his phobia of tree people. In retaliation for him being racist against the trees, one of them falls directly onto him, and a loud stamping creature that we don't see grabs and pulls him away. With this movie making it evidently clear that they are taking a different approach from the original, where that entry used the philosophy of less is more, this entry uses the philosophy of let's make the Blair Witch stomp around in the woods like a Jurassic Park T-Rex. You know, the woman who's supposed to be able to glide through the air without touching the floor, now stomping around like an angry toddler who shit himself. After heading out to search for Peter, James finds the collapsed tree, but doesn't find his friend. So back at camp, they decide to keep the fire going so Peter can find his way back to them, where he in fact does not find his way back to them. Lane and Talia then make a reappearance, despite being sent away from the group earlier in the day, and they tell them that it's been 5 days since they were told to leave, despite them only being sent away earlier that afternoon. The concept of time being something of a great mystery to Lane causes him to run back off into the woods alone, leaving Talia behind with the rest of the group. With nowhere to go now, and 2 missing people out in the woods, they decide to stay where they are for the night, before being woken up by their 7 AM alarms the next morning, to discover that it's still pitch black outside. They once again find tied up twigs and piles of rocks outside of their tents, but this time Lane and Talia had nothing to do with it. Angry, Ashley picks up one that had a piece of Talia's hair attached to it and snaps it in half, causing Talia to also snap in half. That, or she just had the sudden and extreme urge to do some yoga. After Talia's done bending over backwards for everyone, they all take off running into the woods as their tents are violently lifted from the ground as the witch enacts finders keepers rights. Ashley gets separated from James and Lisa, and her wound has begun travelling its way up her leg as her calf begins oozing with pus. Once she's done inspecting the coffee creamer in her leg, she pulls out from her wound what appears to be some kind of twig, as she got confused earlier and thought that's where you're supposed to store them. James and Lisa then hear what they think is Peter talking to them over the walkie-talkie, before Lisa then starts to panic, and we hear the overlaid sound effect of a heartbeat playing on top of the footage, meaning either someone has found this supposed found footage and deliberately added some sound effects on the top for dramatic effect, or Lisa suffers from a serious cardiovascular problem. Ashley ends up coming across the drone in a tree and decides to climb high above the ground to get it, instead of just not doing that. And when she's up there, an arm reaches out of the tree to grab her, causing her to forget about the basic concept of gravity and fall to the ground, where something then drags her out of frame because it's camera shy. Hearing the screams, James and Lisa head towards them and end up coming across the original house. They hear more screaming coming from inside of it, and instead of thinking that the screams belong to Ashley, the person whose screams that they had just been following, James, for some strange reason, instantly thinks that it's Heather. A house that was completely rebuilt and shot on a soundstage, unlike the original movie that used a genuine house in the woods. A house known as the Griggs House, which was demolished shortly after the release of the Blair Witch Project, due to it being a health and safety concern, as the building simply couldn't sustain the weight of that many people coming to stand in its corner. Which, speaking of, James then comes across Peter standing in the corner before he suddenly disappears, which causes James to engage in one of his favourite pastime activities of chasing women in the dark. But suddenly, he finds himself terrified and unprepared as he's actually locked in a bedroom with a woman who suddenly appears and then disappears. Lisa, still outside because that place looks a bit scary, spots the terrifying sight of a naked Caucasian in the woods, so decides to run into the house. Heading down into the basement, because sure, why not go down there, she finds Lane covered in dirt, shouting that Rustin Parr understood that he needed to do what the witch told him to do, before knocking her unconscious and throwing her into the basement's basement. After managing to crawl her way back through the foundations of the house, Lane attacks her, but she stabs him in the neck, just as a hand attempts to get all touchy-feely with her as it reaches out of the wall. We then briefly see a Scandinavian woman, in the form of a tall, pale, elongated witch, as it starts to chase after Lisa, as she ends up recreating the exact same footage that James was watching on the internet at the beginning of the movie, the footage that Lane and Talia supposedly discovered in the woods days ago. She comes across James in the attic, when suddenly a bright light shines from outside the house. Treating the witch like Medusa, they face away from her and stare at the corner. James then starts to cry and blames himself, just how his sister did all of those years ago, as this family has a history of producing crybabies. Before James hears what he then thinks is Heather talking to him, causing him to turn and look at the witch, where he's immediately grabbed. And once again, using the Medusa comparison, Lisa uses the screen from her camera to see the witch behind her as she tries to escape. But using the exact same trick that the witch had just used on James, the witch proceeds to talk to Lisa using James's voice, causing Lisa to turn around and look for him like the simp that she is, giving the witch the opportunity to snatch her up. And silly decisions resulting in horrific death is a pretty good way of describing this movie, as where the original movie relied on nothing more than the footage to speak for itself, 2016's Blair Witch, much like Book of Shadow Blair Witch 2, is a product of its time. Despite Adam and Simon reporting that they would repeatedly and meticulously go over every scare, the movie is still full of fake jump scares, while also using the Paranormal Activity approach of having a low, rumbling sound playing in the background as something scary is about to happen. All signs that tell me that you don't genuinely think that your movie is scary, and you need to artificially enhance that. As for the third time in the video, sometimes less is more. It also appears that The Witch has lost its basic ability to count, as this movie doesn't really fit in with the whole 60-something years theory. Maybe it's dog years. So before this video comes to an end, I'd like to just give a massive shout out and a big thank you to all of the YouTube members and patrons, the people who every month continue to go out of their way to help support the channel, something which I greatly appreciate and I'm incredibly thankful for. If you're interested in becoming a YouTube member or a patron yourself, not only are you just generally being a great help to the channel, but you also get access to a few little cool perks, like being able to join the private Discord server, where you then get links to all uncensored versions of videos going forward. So starting off with the latest YouTube member signups, A big thank you to Jasper875, Marcelli Kenji Noda, TXC0, Cleo Sangelo, James Gunn, Giovanni Rossi, Resident Alligator, Nikki Shohan, Jonas Hurst, John, Blood Eagle, Laberty Rave, David J, Heathen, Orion Wilkerson, Laughable Genius, Waluigi, Mr. Smiles, Guatin, Dylan, Mob, Yuppets Vibe, Zaza Lord, Reek1, The Soldier 420, Jesse Holcomb, Di, Dan McCarty, Shaylee, Sir Dominic, Matthew Green, James, Rashomon, Oscar FN, Caleb, Lika Nagoita, Luca Guarneri, Gremlin Absolute, Zane Monroe, Keegan Neely, BL Doss, Sam Rostang, Ashley Taylor, Vayento, Angelo is the One, Tibbs, KG, Mudazar, Pineapple, Austin Clark, Philip Lissenfield, Difficulty Spike, JT Jar, Ridley01, Praz, Lassie Tykbeer, Javi Lazada, Penta Shurikens, Hakura Harake, KST, The Last Final Girl on the Left, The La Yirad 1, GOJJ, Kenneth Vizen, B4 Still, Irvin Kulin, Scorpy, Travasta 100, B Moose, Pacey02, Seeker, Dan, Curtis Richardson, Surmakova Barbora, Elizabeth Connor, Bo, Justin Perry, Mr. FPS, Vinny Venom, Alan Askia, Raphael Muller, Riley Jane, Kristen Eriksdottir, and Ann Johnson. Now heading over for the latest Patreon signups, a massive thank you to Amir Sanders, Fernando Rodriguez, Robert White, Sean M, Chocolate Cheeks, Kenzen, Matteo Maserati, Daddy Baker, Harvey Tube, Naomi Juarez, Diane Mama, Dre McQueen, Javi Lazada, Nate Nelson, Rickard Nielsen, Miranda Jackson, Marion Cammy's Channel, Crazy Shark 8000, Noxus, Acro Spurch, Sebastian Gress, Rock1138, Linus Dingus, Jacob, Ryland Stevens, Austin, Litboy, King Brit 1991, Sean Cleary, Ian Matter, Saijamu, Cohen, Asa Elite, Ace of Spades, Brandon Wack, Long Kidney, William Bridger, Zandu Gulhan, Valeri Matterman, Michael Centraselli, Medi Sidri, Falling Carcass 23, Cameron Jenkins, Taylor Nelson, Noah, Carson Cornish, Nah Nobody, Justin Dungan, The Turtle House, Roma Division, Effin Grimm, Macboy 700 Onion, Nicholas, Sylville Lim, Elliot Tamala, Honey Bunny, Nicholas Dowdy, Alexander, An Evil Waffle, Hangry, Native 209, Mario Balotelli, It GGG, Hannah, Eli Lynn, Luis A. Medina, Gray 8059, Kyle O'Dwyer, Atkasha Mohan, Claire, Nimbus, Passy McHale, Wanda, Alex, Josip Baganak, Caden Duffin, Willie Boy T, Drain Baton, Christian Oy, Zach Fox, Ethan Neal, C. Phil, Ismir Mayer, Sindre, John Jessen, Brody, DBH X Spartan, Bruce Lee, Raven19, and Block. So once again, a big shout out to all of the YouTube members and patrons, and a big thank you to everyone else for watching.